voice17104.com. This is Zanetta Wingfield, and you're listening to The Voice17104.com. The Voice17104.com.
Welcome, my brothers and sisters, to the Richard James Show on 17104, The Voice. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Ain't no harm to have your mind. My Lord, he said, stay on freedom. You know, it ain't no harm to have your mind. Stay on freedom. It ain't no harm to have your mind. My Lord, he said, stay on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Greetings, my brothers and sisters, and salutations. Welcome to the Richard James Show. God has blessed us with another day and another time to try to do some good and to share with you some information that I think that you will want to hear and that you will get something out of. You know, last month we lifted up Black History Month, and we portrayed the images of people in our struggle, both men and women. Well, this month is what the folks call Women History Month. And we adore, we lift up, we praise, and we thank God for our female counterparts. But I'm going to narrow mine. I'll be quite honest with you. Folks all over will be lifting up women's history. I'm going to lift up African American or Black women's history because of the barriers that Black women have faced, because of the atrocities and the abuse that they have faced. They have never gotten the recognition that they deserve in terms of what they have done for us and our posterity. Never gotten the recognition. But yet, they are a part of our history, and there's a story to be told. And we're going to just lift up some of it. We're going to talk about a few national leaders and what they've done, but I'm going to make it personal, because the person that you should lift up, and I'm talking to you, is your mama, your daughter, your sister, those people that brought you into this world, kept you alive and afloat, gave you Gothic love and loved you when other folks turned their back on you, were those individuals in your family, those people that have done for you. And I bet you, if you go back and you have some discussions with folks in your family, you'll find out some historical evidence about things that they have done that you maybe don't even know a thing about. Nobody's more important than yours. There's a thing out there, different organization where you can go in and find out your lineage and find out exactly what your particular family has done. And I suggest that we do that. Now, we're going to give you the icons we're going to give you the people that other folks know and folks that have made tremendous sacrifice. But I'm going to say it to you again. There's no one or no people more important in our lives than those people that brought us in the world. I'm currently a resident and live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Been here the last trip since 1987. Prior to that, I lived in Harrisburg for approximately 6 years during the 60s. Now I've gotten to know some very, very special people in that time. I have been blessed to have friends and relationships with people who are very special, and some of those people have been women. You know, quite often when projects are put forth, like for example, the civil rights movement, and I was heavily involved as a volunteer, marching the streets in the civil rights movement, and also as a professional, I was heavily involved. But you know, whenever you find a good man that's doing well, God knows you're gonna find a woman somewhere in his life supporting him, lifting him up, giving him advice, and sometimes doing the basic work to make that individual thing happen. That's just the reality. That's in my situation. Always been women that will lift us up. And sometimes they don't get credit for the work that they've done. And I say, thank God for the work that they've done. I have a video that I'm going to show you where Dr. Bell will give you some names of individual women who have contributed to the world, to society, to this country. And she's going to give you some names of some of those individuals to share with you. And I'm going to do the same thing, but I think I'm going to do a few there may be a few names that we both talk about. But I have some names, and the extensiveness of my list include a lot of local individuals. And I'm going to do an introduction with some of the names of people that I have. Then I'm going to show you the video, and then I'm going to come back after the video is over and share you with some of those names you will know, and some of those names you will not know, but you should know. But I'm going to do that, and we're lifting up Black or African American women on this show today. And God knows they deserve it. They deserve it. They deserve it. First name, and I've lifted her up before, that I want to throw out there to you guys, and you will probably hear it again when Ms. Bell comes on, is Gloria Richardson. Gloria Richardson from Chambersburg, Maryland. One of the greatest civil rights leaders in existence. I'm not sure if she's still alive or not. I was told at one point that she maybe had passed, but I know she's almost 100 years old if she's alive, and she lived in New York. And she moved to New York and continued her battle for freedom. But Gloria Richardson organized individuals in Chambersburg. Her organization was a nonviolent organization that preserved the right for self-protection. What I'm saying is nonviolent. They didn't pick up arms. They didn't wear berets. They didn't walk around with guns on their hips. But they preserved the right for self-protection. And because they were under threat, the Klan, White Citizens Council, White Racist Organization, was very, very active on the West Shore and East Shore of Maryland back in the day. If you look at the history of Frederick Douglass, that was his birthplace. He was in slavery doing that. But she lifted up the bloodstained banner. and she advocated freedom, justice, and equality, along with her family who supported her, her daughter, her father, her husband. Uh, Richardson were those people who battled for freedom. And all they did was make it very clear. If you come into the community and you attack us and you shoot us and you kill us, then it's going to be difficult for you. But otherwise, peaceful protests, using the courts, the law, all of that was a part of the agenda of Gloria Richardson. Notice she did not totally subscribe to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King theory that if you hit me on my left cheek, I'll turn to you my right cheek. You hit me on my left cheek, you may have a problem, particularly if you try to denigrate or take my life, like they took the life of Medgar Evers, for example, like they took the life of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, for example, like they took the life of Che Payne and Featherstone, for example, for the three students in Mississippi were murdered by, and then the killers were acquitted by an unjust racist system. Some people, like in Louisiana, they lifted up what they call the Deacons for Defense and Justice. They lifted up their organization. They were patriots. They love America. They support America. And America condones the right of self-protection. And that's what they did, and that's what Gloria advocated, Gloria Richardson. All right, keep that name in mind, Gloria Richardson. You see, we need to write our own history. If we don't write our own history and we don't tell our own story, then who's going to tell it? We've got to do that. So I will lift up again and again and again, Gloria Richardson. Now, let's go to another female leader that you will hear the name, Coretta Scott King. Coretta Scott King. There were things that Coretta did that maybe some of you people don't realize it was Coretta who did it. She created, and was her brainchild, the Martin Luther King Center in Atlanta. And that's where she is in tune with her beloved husband, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. But that was Coretta who built that. King was assassinated at the age of 39. Meantime, Coretta did programs that affected people on a national basis. She consulted with folks and helped them, supported them. She continued the work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, but she never got the support. She was never uplifted. People didn't recognize what Coretta Scott King did. She was a brilliant woman. She was a well-educated woman. And instead of going ahead with just her career in particular, she raised several children. And later was able to get involved with this center and certainly raise those kids because of their father was not allowed to raise them. They were very, very young when he was assassinated. But she gave them, shall we say, a moral core and had them interested in the same type of things that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was interested in. A great woman, a much beloved woman, and a true leader. And a woman that was behind our greatest and best known civil rights leader, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, that supported him and kept him on the straight and narrow, and was behind him in spite of the injustice, and in spite of the attempts to destroy him by our own government, the FBI, Mr. J. Edgar Hoover. In spite of that, he was able to continue his good work. I think finally today, with a national holiday named after Dr. King, that finally he's gotten the recognition that he deserved. There's a monument on the Washington Mall dedicated to him. There are other monuments throughout the country. In fact, they have one in Chester that recognize the heroism, the dedication, the sacrifice. But the sad thing about it is no one is recognizing Coretta Scott King. And so we're gonna lift her up. We're gonna lift her up, and then I said we're gonna lift up the bloodstained banner. That banner is a bloodstained, but yet and still, she did it to death. Let's lift up, before we get to our video, let's lift up another one. Miss Rosa Parks. Had a chance to do some research, background research on Rosa Parks. Had a chance to look at some videos on Rosa Parks and look at the things that she did. And one thing you have to give it to these women leaders. And what is our definition of leader? Someone who has the courage to take risks, to make sacrifice, and do what others will not do. When other Blacks were sitting in the back of the bus and riding their bus to wherever they deemed necessary to go, she just refused to take the abuse, the insult, and she said, I shall not be moved. I shall not be moved, just like a tree planted by the waters. I shall not be moved. I'm fighting segregation. I shall not be moved. I'm fighting segregation. I shall not be moved, just like a tree planted by the waters. I shall not be moved. She will not be moved. She sat in that seat. She will not be moved. She was arrested, taken to jail, and she sparked a movement in Montgomery, Alabama. You should know that Montgomery is the capital of the state of Alabama. And things that happen in Montgomery affect the entire state. You have a large Black population in Montgomery. I have an uncle, my mother's brother, David Armstrong, was a construction contractor, build commercial buildings in Montgomery, Alabama. She stood up and worked with the NAACP, and that's a dangerous thing to do in Alabama. Alabama is no different from Mississippi and Georgia and some of those other racist states. And when I call them racist, it's because I call an ace and a spade. I am from Georgia. I happen to love Georgia in spite of its racism. They call Georgia the peach state. We call it the pecans. But at any rate, she lifted up and she sparked a movement. And there was a young man that came to pastor a church at Dexter Street Church, Baptist Church in Montgomery, by the name of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And that's really where he really got his toes wet, where he really got involved in the civil rights struggle and the movement, with the support of his wife, Miss Coretta Scott King. But Rosa Parks set an example. She later moved north, I think it was to Chicago where she moved. But we have to help credit Rosa for lighting the fire, for lighting the spark that ignited a movement that spread throughout the United States of America and also throughout the world. Because some of our individuals in Africa met with Dr. King, learned from Dr. King, learned from our people, and started their own movement in Africa. So they not only affected what was going on in the United States, they affected what was going on in Africa itself. And I just got to lift up one more woman at this point in the show. Kamala Harris, Vice President of the United States of America. We were surprised, stunned, did not believe it when Barack Obama was named president, was elected, not named, elected president of the United States of America, the first Black man. He was a mulatto, but he was Black. His father, Barack Obama Sr., was from Kenya, East Africa. That constitute a Black individual who was Black. Mixed ancestry like Freddie Douglass and some of our leaders, doesn't matter. He was Black. He was the first. But then a few years later, we elected a Black woman as Vice President of the United States under Mr. Biden, Kamala Harris, former district attorney for the city of San Francisco, former attorney general for the state of California, a very attractive, brilliant, beautiful woman whose mother was a Black Indian. When I say she was Indian, she was Black as I am, and whose father was a Jamaican. And she did her undergraduate education where? Howard University. You heard of Howard University, one of the most noted and one of the largest Black schools in the country. She's a member of a Black sorority. She promotes Black causes. She lifts up Black women. And some white women were very jealous of Kamala Harris. I'm gonna tell her like it is. They were jealous of her. And some of them, they just couldn't stand the fact of a Black woman who was brilliant and has her own mind. So some of these so-called liberal racists attacked her and made life difficult. But in spite of that, Joe Biden saw Kamala Harris's experience. He saw Kamala Harris's ability to do the job, and she's doing a wonderful job, a great job. And she is Vice President of the United States. I supported her when she ran for president. I'm sorry she didn't win. But I also like Joe Biden, because I think Joe Biden is following through on the commitments that he's made. He has appointed a number of people of color in his cabinet. His press secretary is one, Secretary of Defense, another. Yeah, we have a number of Blacks that are in government, Joe Biden, and right by his side. And the next in line for the President of the United States is Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris, born in this country, with as I said, with roots in India and in Jamaica. But understand, and I believe her mother's Black, even though she's Indian. That woman's Black as tar. She is Black, like me, and brilliant when was involved in civil rights, and really set the tone for Kamala Harris to get involved in the same kind of thing. My mother was very supportive. I think his dad was a bit on the conservative side, but that's his problem. But we have a Black female who is Vice President of the United States. And I'm not going to go through all of the Black females that are heading up local governments and cities throughout the United States. City of San Francisco, Black mayor. City of LA, Black mayor. Atlanta, Black mayor, Black female mayor, and all these things. Not just Black female women who are expounding their cause, which is equal opportunity, and also just being good administrators. You see, Kamala Harris does well when he's working with people. She has what we call interpersonal skills. She's able to be a true diplomat and get things done. She's able to communicate with folks, and she is doing the job, folks. And they deserve to be replaced in office. Now we're going to lift up, we have a video that we want you to see, an interview of a young lady, Dr. Bell, who is a professor and also a PhD and a Black historian who will lift up our African-American females and the things they have done historically. Let's roll it. Take care.
And hello, and thanks so much for joining us. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America. And our topic today, the erasure of Black women from history, how and when that has happened. We are so pleased today to have as our guest Dr. Janet Deward Bell, author, social justice advocate, and communications strategist. That's a big title, and she does it really well, who has done extensive research on the women of the civil rights movement and why we know so little about them. Thanks, Janet, for being here today. And we, of course, know each other from always been a huge fan of yours and the work that you do. What's happened to the women in the civil rights, or women, period, how they get erased from history?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me into your community. I think that you really have a fabulous town square for people to talk about the various aspects of Black America. But in terms of the women, it's obviously there's that intersectionality between race and gender. So there, again, within the larger society, as women, they were ignored. Within the various Black communities, and I try not to say Black community as one singular thing, they often were fighting for a place, but the women themselves were so busy, I say, doing the work that they did not necessarily seek the recognition, and they were not able to write it down, to put it down so that it was memorialized. I think about the Alexander Hamilton, which is all New Yorkers are fixated with that.
The whole world,
and
right, fixated. Yes.
Eliza Hamilton lived 50 years after he was killed in the duel, and she was able to tell his story. So who tells the story of the women in the civil rights movement? There's some great scholars. I shy when I call myself a scholar, shy away a little bit because there are great scholars like Beverly Guy Sheftall, Barbara Ransby, Darlene Clark Hines. You know, there are people who really have done so much to lift up and to talk about the women in history, but even all of that is not enough.
Right.
And so shows like this and people talking about it and writing books about it, and that's how we're going to recapture the history and also recapture some of the lessons that we've already learned and seem to have to relearn over and over again. And this is the subject of your dissertation for your doctorate.
Yes. That I'm so excited to know will be a book out next year.
And
I love the title, Lighting the Fires of Freedom.
Yes, because that is exactly what the women did. It wasn't just a big bang that all of a sudden you had this civil rights movement. There was groundwork that had been laid over many decades and years. Women, Black women particularly in the women's club movement, that's one aspect of it. National Council of Negro Women, at the Black colleges, these women were ready. How did the bus boycott succeed? How did people get to work? Why? Because the women, Joanne Williams and others, they started early to come up with alternate means of transportation, how to get those flyers out. We did not have the internet then. You couldn't just email someone.
Right.
How did you get the word out to people? So people had thought far in advance. They were visionaries, and they worked together as a community of engaged people to how are we going to look forward to freedom. So these women were lighting the fires for a long time.
Yeah, and your whole definition of leadership, and you do a lot of leadership training and are very, very good at that. You talk about several kinds of leadership. They're the activist, the advocate, but are and the servant, right, which is an interesting
Servant leaders.
The servant leader, an interesting concept, because many people would think that that's a lot of the women fit in that category, but you said Martin Luther King also was in that category of servant leader.
Yes, it's not servile. It's someone who really understands that their role is to help other people. That their value that they really have is really one of community and lifting up the community. And so Martin Luther King, as with many ministers, are called. You know, in religion, you are called to serve.
Yes.
So Martin Luther King was really called to serve. Rosa Parks, who had started an organization earlier that was one of the backbones of the movement, was a supporter. She was the NAACP secretary, right? And speaking of titles, secretary was not someone who just sat around taking notes and things like that. The NAACP secretaries were people who investigated. Myrlie Evers was secretary to her husband, Medgar Evers. She was, besides being an absolute partner with him in the NAACP, Medgar Evers being the first field secretary in Mississippi, who unfortunately was assassinated in their driveway. Myrlie Evers was his partner in all things.
I want to talk a little bit more about
Yes.
her, but first I want to talk a little bit about you now in terms of, I always ask the guest to place him or herself in Black America. Where do we find you? What were your earliest influences? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania. My mother grew up in a small town outside, 100 miles from Little Rock, Arkansas. My dad grew up in a small farming town outside of Atlanta. So I have really Southern roots. My mother always believed in education because she didn't get an education. She went to 8th grade. My father went to 3rd grade because all the black children were taken out for agriculture, picking cotton, things like that. But my mother always had this fierce notion about freedom. And she was my first leadership model. Her mother was a leadership model. My grandmother was fierce. And she had 3 daughters, my mother being the youngest one. And she really protected them. In those days, insurance people would come around, and they were all white, and they would, on a weekly basis, to get the insurance in the country. And one day, one guy who apparently didn't get the word, "You did not mess with Miss Sophronia's daughters," made a pass, actually fondled one of my aunts. And my grandmother, who was 4'8" or 4'11", we were still trying to figure out exactly how tall she was, because she was really
11, right.
10 feet tall.
Right.
Quietly goes over, picks up a shotgun, and she does it. She aims it, and she gets about this close to young man's ear. Well, he had the good sense to leave. So my grandparents sent their daughters away because I figured certainly they're going to be killed. They're going to be lynched or something. And they sent them, but they were going to stand their ground. They refused to move. So this is the kind of stock I feel I come up, and that I have to uphold. So after about 2 weeks, nothing happened. And they're like, okay, this is interesting. After 2 weeks, another insurance man comes. He goes, "Miss Sophronia?" And as if nothing had ever happened. So that's the kind of courage, the kind of sense of purpose that I feel that I have to live up to. That's my goal every day, to honor their sacrifices, to honor their bravery. So in Erie, Pennsylvania, my family lived on, essentially integrated the county schools. My oldest brother, who's 5 years older than I was the first known black student.
Right.
Because some of us were passing there.
Right,
known
sure.
black student
Right.
at the school. In my graduating class of about 1,300, I was one of 2 black students. So that was part of it. But I was also the president of the youth NAACP when I was 12.
Right.
So I've had this civil rights notion for many, many years. It's in my DNA.
Sure. So your mother went as far as the 8th grade, your
Yes.
dad as far as the 3rd grade.
Yes.
Here you are with your doctorate, and I know that you lived a high-powered educational career, life, how did that happen? I know that she believed in education, but believing it and making it happen in your children is not always the same thing.
My mother was also one of the smartest people ever. The fact that she did not get the chance to share her gifts with the broader community is really a tragedy. And there are a lot of mothers like mine. But my mother was a leader in our community. She was always helping people. She was one of the kindest people ever. And she believed fiercely that education was the foundation for freedom. And she also, it's funny, my nieces and nephews, what they remember about my mother is that when they would say to her, well, how do you spell so-and-so, what's the word? She would say, look it up. And so to
Or
this,
now it would be Google it, right?
they
But
would still look it up.
Yeah.
But so one of my nieces is a professor, and another one is a principal. So they talk about they had to look it up. You couldn't just go to her and say, well, what is that?
Right.
Look, you had to have some sort of energy and involvement in learning the answer yourself. That's how you learned independence. That's how you gained your own wings. And she believed in doing that.
so now you made your way to New York. How was that? How did you get here?
John Jacob, National Urban League. I lived in Washington, where I was the producer at the CBS affiliate, one of the first black television shows in 1969. We called ourselves the Riot Babies. I was a producer for Harambe. And
Right.
yes, and had a lot of wonderful people on that show who really continued my education in terms of informing me about the black community. And I was a youth member of the Washington Urban League board. When John Jacob became president of the National Urban League, after a few years, the director of communications retired, and they didn't have anyone to edit the State of Black America. And I tell the story, Mr. Jacob denies this. They're sitting around saying, now what idiot can we get to come at the last minute to edit a book in less than 3 months? So he thought, oh, I'll get Janet Dewart.
Right.
So I came to New York in 1987 to stay for 1 year, and it's been a little bit longer than that.
It has been, and in the process, married a wonderful man.
Yes, I met Derek Bell because I called him up to submit an article for the State of Black America. And to my shame, I didn't know who he was.
Like probably the most important black lawyer,
I-
professor in the world, right? Or,
yes,
or
and-
not even black, any color, right? So Derek Belt, for those of you who may not know, it was such a principled man that he left Harvard because Harvard was not
would not tenure a
Right.
woman of color.
Right.
And Derek was the first black tenured professor at Harvard Law School. After all those years, he got tenure in 1971. He started teaching in 1969. He got tenure 2 years later. And his first wife, who died before Derek and I met, Jewel Bell, I always lift her up and give her the praise, because after 2 years, Harvard said to Derek, they were going to back out on their deal. They said, well, you need to teach another year, there's some question, blah, blah, blah. Because my husband, besides being brilliant, had only handled 300 school desegregation cases and had worked with Constance Baker Motley and Robert Carter and all those people, Thurgood Marshall.
Right.
I mean, how incompetent can you be? So at any rate, Harvard came up with this thing, well, we want to give you another trial year. You're familiar with that, right? These
Sure,
trial periods
sure.
for black people. Jewel Bell said, no, you kept your end of the bargain. Harvard will keep theirs. And she was so adamant that Derek went and said, 2 years up, you either tenure me or not. And that's how he gained it. And the students loved it. He came there, speaking of leadership, it was the student leaders, not only the black students, but the students leaders who said, we want diversity. This world is changing. We don't want to just be taught by white men. And so Derek really saw his move when he was leading the diversity protests as supporting the students.
Well, one of my all-time heroes, and we'll talk at the end because
Great
you
man.
continue his lecture series and do so much, and have your own scholarship fund, by the way, which I think is terrific.
At
Now,
Baruch College.
At Baruch College. Let's go through some of the women of the civil rights movement.
Love to.
That you think were great leaders. You talk a little bit about Myrlie Evers. Let's go back to her, and tell me what was special about her way of leading?
First of all, each of the women I interviewed is entitled to a book or two by
their
themselves.
own, right.
They're just fabulous. But Myrlie Evers, besides having this sense of partnership, but to be able to, I asked her how she coped when her husband was killed essentially in front of her and her children. And she told me that she played it out in her mind because she knew it was that the times were dangerous. What would happen if? And so it was not that she was fearless. She knew how to cope with fear. And Myrlie Evers, after she stayed in that house for a year and a half or so, and then realized that she needed to take her 3 children to California, where she went back to school and earned her own degree. She is a woman who absolutely knows how to work in partnership, knows how to stand on her own, and she is so supportive of the Black community. So she's, to me, she is my single biggest role model. Derek said to me, he said, "I want you to be like Myrlie Evers." And I told her that, and
Yes.
Mrs. Evers said, "Oh dear."
But continue to be active in the NAACP
And not totally appreciated. Her leadership was supported by her then husband, or her second husband. And so, but the organization has evolved somewhat, but not entirely.
Yes.
So Myrlie Evers, in some ways, it's just, she's a little prickly sometimes, and I love that because she says, and some of the other women also intimated, we're not museum pieces, we are real people. And so that's how I think to know their full complexities is really even more important to know than to know their iconic status.
Right. Well, Kathleen Cleaver.
Oh,
told
I
you,
love her.
I know, so do I. I met her for the first time recently, but certainly had covered her as a reporter when she was with the Black Panthers. Now she's a grandmother and is teaching, she's a law professor. As we sat there and talked about our grandchildren, I thought, what an arc of, how times have changed.
On the run from the FBI,
Oh my
right, on
gosh.
most wanted
Right.
list. But she came back, she graduated undergraduate summa cum laude.
Yes.
She clerked for
Brilliant
Judge
book.
Leon Higginbotham.
Brilliant.
She's one of the smartest people ever. And she still has that fire in her. And it's interesting, a couple of the other women I interviewed they said to me, is she still as beautiful as she was? And I said, yes, she is.
She is, but more than that. Now I would say that in terms of her leadership value, it was the reinvention of her life. I mean, it could have ended with the Black Panther episode, period. We never would have heard about her again. And she invented or became herself who she was intended to be.
But she also reached back to her own leadership model, who was her brilliant mother. I think her mother graduated from college in her teens. Her mother's brilliant. Her father was. They grew up in a almost a Black protected community, a cocoon. So she had this grounding of community and of self. So as many of us did in the 60s or 70s, we had certain kinds of zigzag movements and certain kinds of arcs. But Kathleen had besides her own wonderful brilliance and her own sense of self, she has a sense of adventure. She also really has self-knowledge in the sense that she knows how valuable she is to this world, and she's also dedicated to her grandchildren.
Right, of course, as we know that. What about Diane Nash?
Diane Nash is absolutely she's amazing. She said to me, I tracked her down, she was one of the hardest interviews I ever had, and she said, I'm only talking to you because Ivanhoe Donaldson told me to. And Ivanhoe Donaldson was considered, I called him the strategist of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He died earlier this year. But Diane Nash was played in the movie Selma. And speaking of how the erasure of women from history, they had this pretty actress playing Diane Nash, who's still gorgeous and 70-something, right? And this young woman in the film is sitting on a desk, and she's listening to the guys planning the march and stuff like that. And I'm sitting.
That made me a little.
I was in the theater, and I'm trying to hold myself down and not scream. I thought, This woman is a strategist.
Right.
She was the leader of the Nashville student movement. Why have they diminished her so? And I've asked other people if they noticed her in the film, and they remember this pretty woman on the desk. But they didn't know the history of Diane Nash. Before the Freedom Ride, she had everybody make out wills because it was that dangerous. And so when the government, the United States government, tried to talk the students out of doing the Freedom Ride, she said, "You don't understand. We made our wills out last week. We're ready."
Wow. We're ready. We're ready.
I said, "Ooh."
That's final preparation, right?
And competence. That's a word she always talks about. We have to be competent. We have to be intentional. We have to think about what it is we need to do to march on that road
Well,
to
hopefully
freedom.
when your book comes out, she'll get her full due, you know. She won't be swinging her legs, sitting on a desk, you know, listening cutely to the guys, right?
Horrifying.
What about Gay McDougall?
Gay McDougall was the first black student to integrate Agnes Scott College outside of Atlanta. She was the only one. And she was there for 2 years until she transferred to another school. But can you imagine being the only one in that environment? But Gay later became very involved in human rights and the anti-apartheid movement. So she really organized that, and that's how she met her late husband, John Payton, doing that. But Gay McDougall is I know she's very involved with United Nations activities and what have you, and she's a professor as well now.
Right. Leah Chase.
Leah Chase.
Now you see, these are all names that should be held up high. They lit the fires.
They did.
and we don't know about them as much as we should. So
I think the people who follow the James Beard Foundation for Cooking probably know her more than most other people. Over 90 years old, she's still cooking at the family restaurant that was started by her late husband, Dookie Chase. That's the name of the restaurant.
Right.
But what they did against all of the anti-miscegenation laws, they hosted civil rights workers. That means black, white, and in their restaurant. They could have been arrested. But they were not, because of the respect that the community had for the Chase family, because they were not considered to be wild-eyed and what have you. So people paid attention to what they did. But Mrs. Chase also supported the student movement, and one of the things she said she regretted it, that she didn't support them more. She said we should have listened to these young people.
okay, now Gloria Richardson.
Gloria Richardson of the Cambridge movement in Maryland was considered, I think Jet magazine called her the Lady General of the Civil Rights Movement, because she was one of the first people who said, I'm not quite sure about this nonviolent thing. And that was quite controversial, not only within the movement, but outside of the movement. And there's this great picture of her with the National Guard having their rifles like that, and she's face to face. She was just astounded that anyone would point a gun at her, and she just refused to turn away.
Another movie.
Yeah, and she's still alive. She
Right.
left Cambridge, Maryland. She came up to New York. She was working in the Social Workers Union, Local 371. She's a labor person.
That's great. Now, Dr. June Jackson Christmas.
Oh, my goodness. Who's a psychiatrist who
Yes.
started the community clinics because there weren't black people that were doing that. But one of the things that she and her husband did, I keep saying the late husband, Walter Christmas, he was a journalist, by the way.
Right, yes, sure.
And
Sure.
they would host people from the South, particularly students. They would open their home to give them rest periods, rest and restoration periods at their home. And she never really worked in the South, but she was like many people. See, there's some people who think, like some New Yorkers, if you weren't born in New York, you're really not a New Yorker. There's some people who think, if you really didn't spend 1964 in Mississippi, you really weren't a civil rights worker. You didn't really support, really not a part of the civil rights movement. And we miss those people's contributions when they are supporting, they're raising money, they're bringing people up, they're hosting people like Stokely Carmichael, who became Sekou Touré, things like that. So she was also my pilot interview. She was so kind to me that she really helped me. She helped fortify me to go forth and to interview all these other people.
So talk to me about the toughness of staying in history, staying in the present, because, you know, our friend Gloria Steinem always says, and the reason that people have to be, and you're on the Women's Media Center board, right? The reason women have to be in the day-to-day stories of what's going on is because if they're not there, they won't be in the history books either, you know. And Dorothy Height was one of the examples of being excluded because of her sex and her race, you know. I mean, she fell into that, you know, no woman's land where it was hard for her to get traction for all the amazing things that she did.
Yes, even though she was considered one of the big six, along with various men who got the credit for the March on Washington. And but Gloria, of course, is right, and we see that playing out a little bit with the women of Black Lives Matter.
Right, precisely.
We talked about that because they all of a sudden they're giving the credit to the men. Excuse me, these women were as instrumental, if not more so, in the foundation of the movement and keeping it going. So you really have to write about and talk about Sherilyn Ifill, who is the president and a general counsel, I hope I have that title right,
Legal
Defense Fund,
right,
was the Derek Bell Lecturer last year, and she talks about that you have to, she says similar things to what Gloria says, that someone has to tell the story. And so often, and it's not just in terms of Black people, our society is one, ancient history is 5 years ago.
Right.
So we have to really talk about not only what was done, but what that impact and what the import is for now. And so that's a constant thing to have to do.
Right, and to make sure, because when, you know, this fancy magazine, you know, gave the credit for Black Lives Matter to a guy,
oh, of course,
give him the credit due him.
That's right.
But didn't mention the women at all who started this whole movement. It's like a lot of people began to say it's happening already, you know, that the women are being erased. I always ask my guests, I'm going to ask it here of you towards the end, to finish the statement, the power, the strength of Black America lies in. How would you complete that statement?
Resilience, but a kind of defiant resilience. I think too often we get caricatured as being one thing, either being meek and mild or being militant. There's no appreciation, a little appreciation of the depth of complexity and the diversity within the Black community. But I think that it's we share certain things in common. The women leaders I interviewed share, I reduce it to 2-3 words, which certainly did not capture everything, but the authenticity, the courage, the purpose. But it's a kind of defiance that they refuse to be invisible, they refuse to be ignored, and they maintain their joy in the face of struggle.
Well, thank you so much for that. That sums it up beautifully, Janet Dewart-Bell, for being here with us today.
Well, thank you.
So many thanks to you all out there for watching. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America, and we will see you the next time.
All right. She was absolutely brilliant. I mean, I don't know when that I have enjoyed someone like Janet Dewart-Bell. She was very clear, very articulate, and expressed things exactly the way they are. Thank you so much, Ms. Bell, for your articulation of what is happening with Black women in this country, particularly Black women in leadership. Put it forth exactly the way it is, and was very clear, and would not allow people to stereotype women. You try to categorize them as being either militant or far right or far left or far left, and not everyone fits in the same category. Not everyone has the same skills, the same approach. But thank God for the women that we lift up, that have been so precious and so important for us in this movement. And I want to just continue lifting up a few women, a few names of individuals that have also did that. Now, let me be very clear. There's no way in the world that we can lift up all the individuals that have contributed and that continue to contribute uh, uh, and the contributions in many ways. We emphasize a lot civil rights and struggle. It's because that we are up against barriers. We live in a racist society. And yes, it is racist. It continues to be racist. As a matter of fact, I think things have gotten worse in many areas. We have a right-wing former president that perpetrated the lie and also caused an insurrection at the Capitol. I mean, that never happened in the 60s, I think, to that extent. So we are still battling. So we've got to lift up truth, justice, and equality. And I project love and togetherness and people coming together and trying to understand and respect each other. I think that's important. And I want to continue to just name a few people that have contributed to society. And I'm going to name some local people also that you may not have heard about or you may not hear about. And one such name is Jessica Butler. I don't think Jessica Butler has gotten the recognition that she deserved. Jessica Butler, originally from Texas, she was a school teacher. I think she was recruited by Barton Fields. Barton Fields had a national recruitment program to try to bring African-American teachers into the school district. He did so many things. This is one of the positive things that he did. And I believe Jessica Butler was recruited by him. She came and she taught school and she later was a counselor. But her work in civil rights is noteworthy. She was on the executive board of the National NAACP many years. She was the president of the Harrisburg chapter of the NAACP. And I can't tell you all the battles that Jessica fought while she was in that position. She was one of the most effective presidents that we have had in our history. So we need to lift up people like Jessica Butler, who continues to work and support civil rights and the causes there. When we had political movements, Jessica joined in and supported the candidacy and the people that were running. But when it comes to a fight or a battle, Jessica was there. So I'm going to lift up Jessica Butler. Got to do it. For disclosure, I was one of her vice presidents when she was president of the local branch of the NAACP. And I'll tell anyone that she did a wonderful let me move along. This is not a local person. Willa Mae James Leak. Why am I mentioning her? Willa Mae James Leak was from Georgia, grew up in Philadelphia, moved to Chester, and was later voted in as the first Black mayor of the city of Chester. African-American female, Willa Mae James Leak. And for disclosure again, I am related to her. She was a James, and I'm proud of her. She did a wonderful job. She had a way of bringing Republicans and Democrats alike together. She was a Republican, but she worked well with Democrats and was able to institute changes to help in the city of Chester. We had issues in Chester, crime, housing, different things like that. And Willa Mae James Leak was a wonderful woman. She also was a businesswoman. She had her own funeral home, Leak Funeral Home, she and her husband. So I'm lifting up the name from my hometown, my family, Willa Mae James leap and moving right along, and then coming back to Harrisburg, which has been my home since 1967, and I left for 11 years and moved to Seattle, Washington, and came back in 1987. My home, I want to lift up the name Linda Thompson. I don't care what your personal feelings about Linda. Linda was a very effective member of the Harrisburg City Council. Linda was a writer. Linda was a brilliant woman. I think she graduated from Howard University. And she was the first African-American mayor, female and African-American mayor for the city of Harrisburg. And she fought many battles while she here, and she did a lot of good. Some people get upset with Linda because Linda spoke her mind. She was really direct. Sometimes I got her in trouble. But in terms of her ability to do a job, thank God for the work you've done. Thank you, Linda, for the work that you've done and continue to do. I understand that you're a minister now. Whatever you're doing, we want to sing your praises, because somebody said it couldn't be done, and you with a chuckle replied that maybe it couldn't, but she would be the one that would try. And she tried, and she succeeded. Thank God for Linda Thompson. And I'm going to lift up Patricia Gaston. Patricia Gaston, and if I'm correct, she's hailed from Washington, D.C. Brilliant woman, the wife of the Reverend Dr. Nathaniel Gaskin. She's a brilliant writer, author, a brilliant broadcaster, and a brilliant trainer, particularly in leadership and management and other kinds of things. I had the fortune, when I was in the Department of Auditor General, I was also director of training, and we hired Ms. Gaston to come in. And there's certain techniques and things that she taught us years ago that I still apply. And brilliant woman, wonderful woman, character woman, and we will keep her in our prayers. You know, people's prayer that she comes along well. So I understand she had some health issues, but God bless you. We love you. We support you. And thank you so much for all the work that you've done for all of us throughout the years. That's Patricia Gaston, right? The wife of the Reverend Dr. Nathaniel Gaston. Moving along with some of the people that have contributed. There's an old saying, give me my flowers while I'm living so I can smell them. Don't be afraid to give out those flowers, because it's really, really important. And we must write our own history. We can't expect other people to write the history for us. We got to do it ourselves. There's a lot of names of people that pivoted, and we're getting ready to the end of the show. And I'm going to lift up Mary Elizabeth James. Mary Elizabeth James, in addition to being the wife of your host, Richard James, was the first Black regional vice president for Mellon Bank here in the city of Harrisburg. She graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a master's degree. She's currently the president of the Link organization, and continues to do work for other people, care about other people, love other people, to bring people together. And I'm going to lift up my wife, not because she's my wife, but just because what she's done, and she has a tremendous history. She had open daycare centers in the South. She's a member of VISTA. She graduated from Spelman College also. Just a really, really good person, good human being, an African-American female who we know and love. We're down to the end of the show. Normally I lift up our business at the end of the show, but we're going to close out And we're going to come back again. We still in Black Women's History Month, and we're going to do some more shows on Black women history. Now, on the 14th, I have Ted Reed, who's going to come in and do some things on Black Native Americans. But before we end this month, we're going to do another program because I have a whole list of names that I want to lift up of 3 Black African American females that continue to contribute to society. And we have got to write our own history. If we don't lift these women up, our sisters up, our daughters up, our mothers up, then who will? So I'm going to say, the name of my old friend Toby Young would say, your neighbor and your friend will say so long until next week. And thank you so much for supporting us and supporting our program. And we'll also thank the Thomases for their help and their continued support. God bless and take care.
Thank you again for tuning in to the Richard James Show. Our African and our African American programs are set up to educate you on what's going on in this world. We thank you for taking out the time to listen. Let us hear from you sometime also. So this is your neighbor and your friend signing off. Until I see you again next week and hear from you again next week. So long. God bless.